like fully available.
Welcome, everybody. We will get started in just a minute or two. All right, we can go ahead and get started. So thank you everybody for coming today. Welcome to today's webinar. On behalf of the American Association of Political Consultants, I'm excited to welcome you to our virtual seminar, Strategies to Win in Early Vote States. I'm Kelly Foley from the AAPC team, and I'll be your facilitator today. Please note that this session is being recorded and will be available in our member archive. If you're not yet a member and would like to join, please visit theaapc.org for more details. Today's seminar will run for approximately 45 minutes, including a Q&A segment at the end. You can submit your questions at any time through the Q&A section at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we will address as many as we can during the session. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Rick Ritter, with RBI Strategies. Rick, please take it away.
Thank you very much, and appreciate it. Welcome all of you online to this webinar. We have a very highly qualified group with us today. Sylvia Allen-Hoover of the United States Postal Service, Dave Johnston of POOLHOUSE, Edith Jorge-Tuñón of RSLC, Danielle Cendejas from the Strategy Group, and Henri Makembe from Hamlin Street Group, I'm sorry. Their bios are available through the AAPC website. If you go to the agenda page for the 2024 Poly Awards conference, you can find their bios there for further information. And with that, let me turn this over to Sylvia Allen-Hoover of the United States Postal Service as we begin the discussion of early vote in 2024.
Thank you, AAPC and Rick. I'm going to highlight some of the research-based actionable insights from our latest annual joint white paper with AAPC that can be used to inform strategies to win in early vote states. And in order to substantiate what we are seeing and hearing each election cycle and best support campaigns looking to integrate direct mail into their engagement strategies, we've been conducting post-election voter and consultant research and developing joint white papers with AAPC since the 2016 election cycle. And now notably, our latest research focuses on bellwether gubernatorial and mayoral elections, measuring current voter perceptions and political advertising channels to capture what has shifted and what has stayed the same leading up to the 2024 elections. And while not every surveyed voter recalled receiving direct mail during the 2023 elections, for those that did say that timing, targeting, and tailoring impacted engagement across all demographics and should be considered to ensure a successful campaign strategy. Now, historically, direct mail has been extremely effective during the get out to vote phase of an election cycle. And many of the campaigns that I've worked with wanted direct mail to be the last thing a voter sees before entering the voting booth. And our research found that voters would actually prefer to start receiving mail earlier during the election cycle, though. And due to the expansion of voting before Election Day, makes it even more crucial for campaigns to start integrating and leveraging every channel in the media mix earlier than past election cycles. And our research also found that voters feel direct mail was harder to ignore than other advertising channels. So campaigns should start utilizing direct mail as a starting point for engagement in order to break through the clutter. And with that being said, direct mail can and should be the first thing a voter sees during an election cycle and the last thing a voter sees before entering the voting booth. Our research also shows that voters have a unique relationship with direct mail that can be leveraged to increase engagement. Voters are still consistently checking their mailboxes at least 4 days a week, and many were happy receiving mail pieces almost every week of the past election cycle. In fact, many of the voters feel like the amount of mail pieces received were just right. So for those of you who are already integrating direct mail into your campaigns, you're doing it well. Many voters also feel less overwhelmed when engaging with campaigns through direct mail and prefer the choice that it offers to engage when they had time to read it. And so when using direct mail as a starting point for engagement, it's also important to recognize the types of content that will have the most impact in mail pieces. And the research shows that voters want to receive comprehensive information across a variety of areas in all mail pieces, including early voting information. And voters were more likely to engage with the mail piece if credible sources were included and the information could be fact-checked online. You can visit our Deliver the Win website if you want to learn more about our latest annual joint white paper.
All right, thank you, Sylvia. Hello, everyone. Good to have you all on here virtually. I'll assume everyone is nodding and smiling back and saying hello back and everything through the muted Zooms. So let's kind of take a step back on strategies to win early vote and just kind of look at the bigger picture and kind of like come in on this. I think it's a very interesting data point that over the years and over the cycles, increasingly, early and absentee voting is taking on a larger and larger total vote share of total votes cast over cycle. And no doubt, and I think everyone on here would be in agreement on this, that trend is likely not going to change. People are becoming more and more open to and more interested in voting differently than just on election day, whether that is through absentee mail ballots or whether that is through in-person early voting. That trend line is increasing. And if you plot out over the last several cycles as well, the amount of total money spent on just TV advertising, since I'm a TV ad maker and covering kind of that portion of it, I'll focus more on that component of it. But overall, total campaign spending, it really spikes in that last a few cycles ago, really spiked in that last final week leading up into election day. And as this trend has shifted to a larger portion of vote share being absentee and early vote, that has flattened a degree, and more budget share is being spent early or in the election cycle and towards the earlier beginning cycle of October, and sometimes in some cases beforehand. And that is an important thing, I think, for all of us to pay very close attention to is our budget being appropriately applied to what the strategic needs are given the race that we have in front of us. And this turns into a resource allocation problem, which is ultimately what I think most decisions that campaigns come down to are about, is resource allocation decisions, how to do that. And early and absentee voting is both a challenge and an opportunity for us. As that increases, that is going to stretch budgets that either, as we all know, campaigns are not always the most well-funded thing in the world, and that we have to make some really, really tough budget allocation decisions. And that is no doubt true to our media mix as well, and makes it more complicated, makes it more challenging. That's something we have to pay very close attention to. And this goes back into ultimately knowing what the rules are and the data are for our given races that we are working on. I think it's really important to note and understand the differences of types of absentee and early vote, because not all absentee, not all early vote are the same. There are some places where that is in-person early voting, that is extremely heavy. There's a difference between all absentee mailed ballot states like Colorado and Utah. And there's a difference between states that have both or a combination of both. In some states, the absentee ballot portion is a much larger vote share than in-person early vote is. In other places, the exact opposite. In Texas, for instance, ABEV makes up 60, usually on average, about 70% of total votes cast will be done AB and EV. Of those 70%, about 80% of those will be done in-person early voting. And then it gets even more interesting on the data and those trend lines of some of those, they get cast all within the last 5 days of early vote, as opposed to the first week of it. So understanding and knowing what the data is showing on what the rules are for how absentee and early vote is really critical to making those smart choices to stretch dollars as far as we possibly can on our campaigns, which we're all trying to and striving to do, but making sure to apply them correctly. And then that also applies to how your message and your media mix needs to be. With the increasing absentee and early voting, it is no longer you can go up with your peak message in the final week and that be it. Part of what your right media mix needs to be is when are your most critical voters voting? If your polling and if your data shows and suggests in your particular race that your winnable, persuadable voters are going to be voting earlier and absentee, then you need to make sure that you are making your most persuasive media message just before and peaks just before that starts, if you can, right? In places like Colorado, for instance, not to keep beating up on Colorado, right? They send out absentee votes really far in advance to everybody. Everyone gets a ballot mailed out to them. And a lot more of the persuadable voters, undecided voters, do tend to wait until the very last possible minute. Democrat voters tend to vote earlier, and Republican voters tend to vote to the last possible couple of days on that. But it's also a very expensive media market. And so if you have a stretched budget, that gets into a really tough choice, and you have to follow your data of when are the voters you need to maximize reach, while also being able to afford, being able to maintain message parity going into that final stretch, into when to reach out to those voters. And so making sure to pay attention to and note what the data is on what that proper mix will help you be able to stretch out your dollars to the right time to be able to get the maximum message penetration into the maximum amount of voters and to peak at the right time for it. Increasingly, TV spending is getting front loaded to it. It's a tool that we got to pay attention to and increasing the look at of voter information sharing. If you need to go reach voters who you're most likely going to get them if you're having a GOTV problem, which going into a presidential cycle is going to be a little bit different and a unique challenge in of itself. But if you're going into a presidential cycle, do some of your messaging and some of your TV advertising need to have a more direct call to action of not just go vote, but specifically go vote early, go vote absentee, return your ballot, and have that as the call to action in the closeout of your television advertising or any of your advertising for that matter in what that mix is. So paying attention to what the rules are and then following religiously the data of what is and will help us all make better and smarter choices as this landscape gets more and more complex for what is the right mix of and what is already expensive and difficult budget decisions that we have to make as we go down the stretch into these elections. And with that, I think I'm passing the baton over to Danielle.
Actually, I think the baton is being passed to Edith, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Oh, my bad, Edith.
No,
You'll pay for it.
yeah, I think, and this actually segues nicely into a lot of the points that Dave made, two of which I think I will harp on a little bit more, but they relate to one another. One is budget, right? It is very important that you know, the way that we look at ABEV at the RSLC is it is not a part of the campaign, it is in addition to the campaign. And the reason that we do that is because we acknowledge that, every campaign has in the past, and especially now in the future, is going to be looking at, how do they lay out their budget so they can target, all of that persuasion, GOTV, so on and so forth, universe that they need to in order to, win on election day. But, included in that is, are they going to chase any of the outstanding ballots, or are they going to send, an application? They will have an ABEB plan kind of incorporated in that. And we want to help, whether it's caucuses, campaigns, candidates, be able to kind of commit to those plans. But everything that we do on the absentee and the early side, we like to do in addition to what we're already committed to on the caucus and campaign side. And I think that it's very important that you also kind of, when you're putting a plan together, be realistic with what you can and what you can't do. If you're in a state where you can coordinate with some of these bigger committees, whether that's your own caucus, whether that's your state party, or with the RSLC, find out, who's doing what, so that you can plan accordingly. And again, your budget makes sense for the campaign that you're trying to run. And so that kind of hits on the first point too, of how you target each state differently. We're a 50-state organization. And so that means that the way that you would run a campaign in New York is going to be very different than a way that you would run a campaign in Texas. But not only are the kind of actions that you take going to be different, but legally, it's two completely different ways of even being able to engage in the state from a reporting perspective, from a what type of money can you even use in the state. And so you take all those things into consideration and you really build a plan that is tailored to that. But then again, you overlay whatever it is that your absentee and early voting plan is going to be. A big part of this, though, is because we view absentee and early voting as an extension of a low propensity voter engagement plan. So really what we say is, we know that a lot of campaigns, caucuses, states, they're going to do some type of ABEV or GOTV effort to that mid to high propensity voter that they're targeting, both, Republicans, independents, and in some cases, again, depending on the state, some of those soft Democrats. So who is it that we can go after that if we start early enough, which we've heard now from pretty much everyone, and we do a consistent kind of messaging arc to them, we think that we can turn them out. And we also know that other folks aren't going to be talking to. Well, for us, that's the low propensity, low persuasion, low turnout persuasion universe. And so what we have done in the past and will be doing this cycle is starting as early as March, April to message to these individuals. And it's not just, kind of like your regular campaign messaging. It's quite literally like, hey, did you know that you can vote as early as, depending on the state, 45 days out? Did you know that you can just request this or fill out this application and you'll get a ballot for every election from today forward? Did you know X, Y, and Z? And then on top of that, we start a persuasion campaign to talk about what are some of the issues that are important to some of these voters, what are some of the issues that our candidates stand for in the state, and what are reasons for this person to take an action. So you have to view this as very much kind of an education component to a certain respect. If you're going to take on this broader absentee and early voting turnout operation. So there is a huge kind of educational component to this. And depending again on your state, there might be even this persuasion, not so much in a turnout candidate perspective, but persuasion in a, okay, hey, this is safe to do. Hey, it's okay to vote by mail. It's okay to vote early. You don't have to wait until election day. And ultimately, what this is all really doing is it's giving every single one of these individuals numerous opportunities to take an action. And that's the ultimate goal, right? All of what we're talking about, everything that we strategize upon, the ultimate goal is to get individuals to take an action. And so we'll start as early as March, April, and we'll, try to get them to request a ballot, request a ballot, request a ballot. If they do, that's great. We kind of move them to a new bucket where now what we need to do is get them to return that ballot, return that ballot, return that ballot. But say they don't request a ballot, okay, let's move them into a different bucket. Let's push everything towards getting them to vote early. So now for 2 months, 1 month, 2 weeks, all of those resources are just to get them to take an action during that X amount of window to go vote early. And now that's our second opportunity. If we still can't get them at that point, we still know we have one more chance, and that's on election day. So we shift our resources again, and everything that we do is pushing these folks to go take an action on election day. So really what we're doing is we're giving ourselves a really broad window of time to get these folks to take any type of action, whether that be filling out the application, filling out the ballot, going out and voting early, or going out and voting on election day. We have now effectively given ourselves really an increased, like I said, window of time, but also it lets us bank that vote, as they say, way sooner so that we can kind of move on to a different audience. The second and third bullet we kind of talked about, it's you start earlier than ever before, especially if you're gonna kind of be engaging this lower propensity audience, and you continue your efforts all the way through election day. The thing that I want to emphasize based on just some of the research and the numbers that we kind of crunched here at the RSLC, in the past, because some of you might be thinking like, well, this has never been done before, or traditionally the advice that you will always get is, don't go after this like hard to reach voter, right? Because it takes a lot more for them to take an action. It costs a lot more money, and it's just not worth your time. And while traditionally that probably was the right message, here's the reality, at least for us and many of you who might be running or might be managing campaigns at, say, the legislative level and quite frankly, even the congressional level, we're winning and losing these races quite literally by a handful of votes to a couple of hundred votes. And so what we really did was we kind of reverse engineered and said, okay, well, what is the percentage that we need this low propensity universe to be performing at to make it worth us investing in, this program, this universe? And what we found was on average, we just needed them to perform at a 2.6 return rate. So on average, we took a district, we looked at this low propensity universe that no one's really talking to. I'm talking about your 0-4s, what we would have traditionally called your 0-4s, your 1-4s, maybe your 2-4 universe. Okay. So this non-voting, low propensity voting universe. We said, okay, from this number, how do we make up the margin by which we lost this district by a year ago, 2 years ago? And we did this in a number of different places. And like I said, on average, we just needed that universe to perform at a 2.6 return rate. Now that's really low. And so when you kind of take things into consideration, if you're starting as early as March or April to get a universe to just perform at a 2.6% return, I mean, that's very doable. And on average, what we saw, we were actually getting returns at around 6% in a lot of the races that we kind of built out this plan in Virginia. And we're seeing similar results in states like Pennsylvania with registration rates and also folks kind of staying on the permanent list. And again, this is all to that low propensity universe. So I would kind of just leave you with this closing thought, and it's be smart about how you allocate your budget. Anything that you do with this low propensity universe as it may relate to absentee and early voting, remember that it should always be in addition to, not as part of. That's not to say that absentee and early voting should not be a part of your regular campaign plan. It absolutely should be. And the last kind of point that I'll hit on is, don't underestimate the ability to turn out folks within a much larger stretch of time. Give yourself the space to be able to utilize that full voting window and do so by preparing early and effectively. And with that, I'll kind of hand it back.
Thank you very much. And our next speaker will be Danielle Cendejas.
Thank you. So I wanted to take us back a little bit into the year 2000, which happened to be my first election as an 18-year-old, very excited to participate in our American democracy. But if you look at sort of what the rules of the game were, I mean, back to what has been said by Dave is, you have to sort of know what the rules are of, the jurisdiction that you're running in. And 40% of all voting age citizens lived in states that had at least one option for early voting. If we fast forward to where we are in 2024 on the next slide, you'll see that we are at a nearly 97% of people voting age citizens living in the states that offer at least one option. So we are, election day is much longer than just the, 10 or 12 hours when the polling places are open, which means that campaigns need to adjust to when people are voting, how they are voting, what is the way in which that they can participate. And, is there any sort of data that shows when they are doing this? And so in California, we've always had some sort of absentee voting, but in 2020 we turned to a 100% vote by mail state, and that has been the rules of our game moving forward will be 100%. Everyone gets a ballot as long as they're registered to vote. And so, one of the things that we take a look at is what is the historical data show us of when people are voting? Because as you know, California is a very expensive state. It is an incredibly expensive place to communicate in. And so we have to take a step back and say, what can we do to sustain a 5 to 6 week election plan? But really the other question that we ask is, do we need to? And so, if we move on to the next slide, what we'll see is sort of what is the habitual behavior of the California voter. And so what we looked at is out of the 22 million registered voters here in this state, only, close to 3%, 2.9% are people who have a habit of getting their ballot, filling it out, turning it in right away. And so, that's a huge chunk of the electorate if you look at, where it is, but it's also, not, where you want to spend all of your resources either. And so what we tend to look at is when we're making plans for voting, or we're looking at where to spend late money, we don't look at a district and say, oh, it's too late. You've had 5 weeks of voting and you can't affect the electorate anymore. Because what we know is that even in the last 8 days of the election, 54% of votes are still on the table. And so when you're looking at, how do you put a communications plan together, you have to sort of manage your resources in a way of, do we have enough communications to talk to this 15% of people who turn in their ballots, before they get received before the first 8 days of, or before they let 8 days out, or, do we need to, sort of bank our budget to really focus on those last minute voters, the people who have their ballot around and we have to go pry it out of their hands and make sure that they fill it out and return it back. I want to talk a little bit about what we did in this last primary. And so in California State Senate District 25, on the next slide, what you'll see is the data that we did that was district specific. So this was a redistricted area that was the first time that we were electing somebody new in this seat. It had been, it's the first time it was open, in a while. And so it was a very crowded race, and one where we had to be very nimble about the people of which and when we talk to people. If we look, this is an area that is a little more highly educated than your average state Senate district. It is one where there's a lot of civic participation. And so we see that the early vote is slightly a little more than what the state average was by a percentage point. And so this helped us inform what our overall strategy needed to be in order to win this race. If we go to the next slide, we can give you a little sense of the dynamic of what was, kind of occurring here. This was a candidate field of 5. We had 4 Democrats and 1 Republican. One of the Democratic candidates, mostly self-funded, she had a war chest of $3.4 million. Our candidate, Sasha Renee Perez, raised close to $920,000, and she had the official Democratic Party endorsement. We also had support from a lot of the progressive organizations, labor unions, environmental, voters and whatnot. So we had a broad coalition of people that you want to kind of go to war with in a Democratic primary, but we knew we were going to get outspent. So our challenge was, how do we sustain a communications and field campaign for a 5-week election that was on Super Tuesday, knowing that we'll, be outspent? And one of the dynamics that we wanted to also create was, knowing that the Republican might be able to consolidate the spot, how do we make sure we are that Democrat that moved into the top 2? And so this is how we did it. On the next slide, you'll see that we had our mail plan. We did a 7-week mail plan. Our opponent had been in the mail, and we thought she would be in the mail right after, you know, the right after New Year's. And so we didn't have the resources to compete for 2 months, but we really wanted to make sure we got some communications in closely after Martin Luther King Day. And so we started dropping mail in mid-January, and we went consistently up until what is typically the, you know, 30 days out of the election on February 5th. The ballots in LA County tend to go, this is a pro tip for anyone working in LA County, they tend to arrive a little earlier than the state average does, because the statute is that all of the ballots have to be mailed by 30 days before the election. So LA County is always a few days before receiving it. So about that weekend before, when people started receiving their ballots, we had already had 3 pieces of mail hit to get to that kind of early vote and start to get our message into the conversation. We then took a break, partly for budget reasons, but we were also hoping that our independent expenditure partners would sort of help fill in the gap, which they did. And then we started kind of moving to a different message lane that was more persuasive. You know, our first sort of piece was talking about reproductive rights and the contrast we had with our opponent on that. Then we started moving into our education message. And then we really wrapped it up with the homeless contrast, because our polling showed us that that was what, you know, was really the thing that would be our closing argument. We went consistently heavy, you know, on the mail, but, you know, trying to find ways in which we could shave off our budget. So we took out people who were those 6% or the 3% of the always early voters. We removed them from this sort of middle of February track. And then we only went to women in our last track for, you know, budget purposes, and to make sure that we were getting to the people who were most likely to vote for us. And so that last week, when most of those ballots were being, you know, cast, we were really focused on, you know, making sure we got our closing argument in. We also went and did this on digital too. If we look at the next slide, we could see sort of the flight dates were different. So we had what made sense for us is to target this by geography. The places where there were more highly educated and more, you know, in-tuned voters were the ones that were who were, you know, tended to be early voters. So we looked at the data and we figured out, okay, if we make sure that we're targeting to these people earlier, we're going to get more bang for our buck there. And then we could save our resources and start our flight date for what we call the lower San Gabriel Valley and the city of Glendale a little later in the game. We also did the similar thing on Meta, you know, with the social media ads. And then we really kind of moved into a GOTV phase in the last 5 days, you know, really featuring some of the endorsements. We had Adam Schiff's endorsement. He was someone who is beloved in this area since he used to represent it in Congress. And so we really moved some of our money into those resources to give that kind of closing argument as well. And then our field campaign, we, you know, knowing this, you know, this is a district, if you remember from the one of the first slides, it's at 600,000 potential voters, right? And so field was something that we wanted to make sure that we were being really thoughtful about using our volunteer resources wisely. And so we focused on people. We used some of the scores that are available on PDI's file to find the more progressive voters who would be, you know, more interested in knowing about our candidacy very early on. We really focused on high propensity. And then we looked at who actually votes in these early, you know, which are the precincts that tend to have a lot of early voters, and we focused there. So the cities that we focused on were South Pasadena, which had a huge propensity of early voters, as well as Claremont and Pasadena, again, all highly educated, a lot of primary electorate voters. And then we started introducing late voters into our universes in February. And then we excluded our early voters from our last week of the election and started opening up the audience to more mid-propensity voters to try to give us more scale, since we had a lot more volunteers towards the end of that. But the tiering of this was really intentional to make sure that we were on the doors talking to people who had a habit of voting early before our opponents were able to get to them either. And the next, we also did a lot of text messaging, probably an overabundance of text messaging. And but we, didn't just text a broad audience, over time. We really were thoughtful about matching our mail targets, making sure that we were also getting, these different pieces in language, and then to our targeted audience based on the type of message that they wanted to hear. And then our GOTV, if you hadn't turned in a ballot and you were still on the file, we made sure you got at least 4 messages to try to get that turnout juiced for us. And then we can go to the results. And so we ended up getting the right scenario that we wanted. The Republican consolidated a spot and got into the #1 spot. And then Democrats, split between 4 ways, but Sasha was the resilient one who was able to get into that #2 spot with 32.9% of the vote. Yvonne Yu here, who got 17.5% of the vote, was the one who spent $3.4 million. And so overcoming that huge spending deficit, having the right strategy, meeting voters when we needed to meet them was, the way in which that we won the election. And if you go to the next slide, what I want to point out is, tracking when these votes are happening, right? So if you work in California and you're not subscribing to the PDI tracker on absentee voters, you should make sure you sign up as soon as the ballots start getting engaged. And what we, we're tracking through, we had predicted that this was going to be about a 36% turnout. We ended up being at 33%. But when you'll look at is on March 5th, that's the, election day, the last day that we got, returns reported from the registrar, we were at 22% turnout. For the ballots that were in transit from March 5th up until the week later that they were able to be received, that was an 11% amount of votes that still came in. So it is true, election day lasts a month before election day, it lasts a month after election day because of the amount of voters that just vote late. 76% in this particular district, in this particular election, returned their ballots within the last 8 days of the election. And so the moral of the story here is really just following the data, making sure that you have a communications plan, that all of your modes of communication are working together, and that even if you're going to be outspent, even on the smallest budgets, you can figure this out to make sure that you're meeting the voters exactly when they need to be hear from you, and ensure that you get the messages to them at the right time.
Thank you very much. Our next and final speaker is Henri Makembe of the Hamlin Street Group.
Hey folks, thank you so much for joining us, and Rick, thank you for that. And Danielle, we always like Democrats winning in California, so we'll take that. I think what I want to do is kind of wrap up by kind of bringing together what folks have said. I think a lot of what you're saying on the screen is going to kind of repeat itself, right? I think per Edith and Keith's comments earlier, it's like what we found is that if you focus on how easy it is to vote, right, we did some tests in Pennsylvania last cycle. If you focus around how easy it is to vote and vote early, right, then folks are really going to respond to that as opposed to going to the issue, right? Make it about a logistic thing. And we've seen some study coming out of the Analyst Institute, kind of echoing those efforts, right? And social pressure obviously does work for that, especially when it comes to direct mail. But obviously, keep in mind when you're using that tactic, it can be a little bit creepy on the internet, right? I think folks are already concerned as to whether or not their phones are listening all the time. So you kind of have to write that balance between how do you kind of focus on telling people when and how to vote, and then how easy it is to vote with how do you track them online. I think Danielle touched a little bit about this. How do you create a surround sound on a target audience? Right, different audiences are going to vote differently, right? And you really want to make sure that you use your budget and your timing adequately to make sure that you're hitting them up direct mail, hitting them up on TV, hitting them up digitally, and so they really feel like you're having the same messages being reinforced across channels and across the mediums, right, throughout the cycle, whether it's on a time basis, right, and kind of layering it in on a timeline, or layering it in the same time, but across different channels, like, right? So something for you to kind of think about, especially if you can, the earlier you can start that, the more you can get it. Danielle hit on this last on a project, is get your data flow early, because that's going to save you some money. If folks have already voted, like, right, make sure they're out of your target pool when you're going out and creating that echo chamber, right? So you have to make sure that your data is correct. And if you're going to create a good kind of surround sound around folks, make sure that you can follow them throughout the internet. So really find partners that have good data, have good identity, and really kind of talk about that, and then use that to follow folks around the internet and kind of create that surround sound. But also when folks have voted, they're taking an action, make sure you can be able to pull them out in a timely manner so you can have your budget work for you efficiently. Lastly, I mean, start early so you have room for experimentation. Like, right, some of the mediums that we are talking about today haven't, born around last cycle. If somebody would talk about TikTok last cycle, you'd be like, what are you talking about, man? But somehow, if you manage to do an election without having a TikTok, this cycle, I'm not sure that's really going to work. So really, I think you really want to leave room for experimentation with mediums, and also Messenger, right? And an election where people kind of consume their own media and have basically created media and consumption habits for themselves, like, right? The same folks are not going to resonate with the same audience, with different audiences. And so you really got to go with that, right? One example of that we found last cycle is we were trying to do a campaign around the income tax credit, right? And we used some influencers, and the best performing ad in that particular campaign was really a woman sitting in front of a chair and doing her makeup and doing one of those get ready with me videos, right? And talking about the income tax credit. Now, if you would have told me that would have been the best person to talk about the income tax credit and really to that specific audience, I would have been like, absolutely none of that, right? So I think really leave your room, leave time for testing, and the earlier you can start, the more you can test, and the more you can then take advantage of the result of those tests, right? And that's all I have for you. We have a couple of questions in the chat. Rick, do I hand that back to you?
Yeah, I believe you do. And let's begin with the question from, first of all, thank you, Henri. James writes, thoughts on when, if at all, to start tapering ad spend within the early vote window. Dave?
Yeah, I'll jump onto that one. Actually, I think I'll knock out Rod's as well. On the radio thing too, just while we're at it, to knock out both with one stone. Radio is definitely an important part of your media mix. And it is definitely an important component, and it's similar to like going back into just the broader question of what is the right medium mix for advertising. I loosely will throw in radio in with broadcast as just, TV advertising broadly speaking, but that you got to go follow the data and see where you get the most eyeballs for it and what's the most efficient. In some places, radio is a great tool. Other places, it's not so good. And then same thing with broadcast, same thing with cable. I think it's very dependent upon what the race you're in and everything, but radio is definitely an important part of that, Rod. So great question. Thank you for clarifying that for all the viewership. So tapering off, James, I think that's a great question. And I think all of us would be in agreement on is that there is no hard rules to kind of live by or follow on it. It's very specific and conditional upon the race and the context and the issues that you may be dealing with. For instance, it depends on how large the vote share is. What does the polling show where your target audiences are and how they're planning on voting? It also is conditioned in large part off of what your budget situation is and how expensive the media markets are for that. So as a really horrible, hopefully a semi-helpful answer way to inform that, to kind of recreate a scenario for that. If you are, for instance, in a race where you have really, really heavy early voting and you're in a position where 80% of your vote share is going to come from that early vote period. For instance, if you're in Texas, right, very large early vote share portion that's likely going to happen there. Sometimes in some districts and some races in Texas, it can approach up to 75, near 80% of vote share is ABEV there and everything. If you are on a stretched campaign and with a stretched budget, where you do not have very many dollars to go and everything, and you have to make tough choices of, I can either wait until the very end and just get completely killed, what we like to call, crushed in the cradle, killed in the cradle, where you waited too long and your opponent was able to define you before you could do that. And so you needed to start a little bit earlier, because that early vote does start that. And you have to make a choice there. I think that is one of those things where, based in that scenario with that very limited information, it is willing and able to cut off that last final week. If you know that your primary vote share is in that first week of early voting, to be able to get the weight that you need to define yourself before your opponent defines you for that. And so it's going to be very specific, but I don't think that there's any real harm based off of when your vote share is coming in to be able to taper off on the back end of that to save you a resource. Again, you want to hit your peak messaging when your peak amount of voters are voting. That is the one thing I do think is a general good golden rule to live by, and everything is you need to make sure that your peak, whether that is your strongest messaging and both also your strongest weight, are peaking at the same time that the peak of your key voters are voting. And I think Henry wants to jump in there and chime in there too.
Yeah, I just want to echo the last thing that Dev said. Hit your peak voter when you're voting, and that makes sense. And also wanted to add to Rod's comments about radio. So when I think medium, I definitely think about radio, but I also think about podcasts and streaming audio, right? And we were running a Senate race out in and state Senate race out in Pennsylvania, where one of the best performing medium that we had for us was targeting the. What's that? Rick, say that one more time.
We're good. No,
okay.
Yeah, we were cutting out briefly.
Oh, sorry about that. So one of the best performing kind of mediums that we had for us targeting the Latino population was actually streaming radio ads, right? And that was very effective in that specific state Senate race in Pennsylvania. And so definitely when we're thinking about channels, we're thinking about all channels: paper, TV, video, digital, SMS, and audio as well. Whatever you need to get in front of voters. Just not pigeon birds, because that's not going to be effective.
We have a final question here, which is what kind of features can voter contact technology providers build to better support ABEV operations? Anybody wish to take that one on?
I'll jump in for that one, because this is actually something that I've been thinking about for a while. Mostly because it's very dangerous. When I was one of my very first campaign jobs, I was in New Mexico, and or at least it was the very first time doing this, we were trying to get voters to vote early. And there was a 2-week early voting window, but the very first week it was limited locations, and then every couple of days they would open more locations until the weekend before, where you would have all of your early voting locations, and then obviously you had several days, and then your last opportunity was to go vote in person. Well, in any case, we were trying to deliver mail pieces that all had what their early voting location was, but as you can imagine, every couple of days we had to update it. Because if you give a voter a mail piece with a voting location that's not theirs, it's illegal. You actually could go to jail, type of thing. All that to say, it was very complicated. We were able to get it done. It literally required us printing daily, verifying, calling offices daily, making sure that these were the correct addresses that belong to these correct precincts, so on and so forth. And so one of the things that I would love to see is if there was almost like a texting AI, where I would load my entire universe of people that I want to get to go vote, and then that person could respond with their address, and then the AI would tell them what their nearest voting location was. So obviously there are websites that can do that, but I wish a vendor would invent a texting AI platform where all the person had to do was respond with their address, and they would be told exactly where they needed to go vote or cast a ballot.
Thank you very much.
I would love that too, Edith. But I did want to just kind of, say, I think sometimes the language that is used, you know, when you have like suggested scripts or, you know, suggested tactics, like it's a very insider language. And so I would sort of encourage anyone who has like voter contact tools or is trying to pitch voter contact to really kind of think through what is kind of the best language that is, you know, plain language, right? Like what is the thing that my, you know, almost 70-year-old father is going to be able to really understand, right? Like I see too many folks who say ballots have dropped. And like, if people who are male know that, but they don't know, you know, what that means for, you know, and Henry's laughing because he's probably lived through this too. You know, voters don't know what drop means. Voters don't know what something to drop in the mail means. And so I've seen too much language where the suggested text or the things, you know, if you're a really, you know, down ballot candidate and you don't have a lot of professional help, you're not going to think through the best way in which to communicate. So if you have suggested, you know, templates or you're using language that, you know, is overly, you know, social pressure that might not fit for that district, really kind of think through like how you could suggest that this kind of works, and also just be culturally sensitive too. Like there are definitely differences in voter contact, you know, the way in which different communities, you know, respond to vote by mail or respond to early voting or even respond to just even, you know, doing something out of the norm of voting on election day. And you kind of have to respect that. I think some of the, you know, we all want to bank our votes, but, you know, there are times where it's like people, you know, they go after church and they do the souls to the polls and this is their tradition and this is what they want to do. And you kind of have to, you know, let them do that. And so understanding how can you tailor your tool to make sure that you have those either tags or some sort of like option that really respects the culture that you're kind of walking into for the district that you're running into.
Thank you very much.
If I can jump in here, and I think David is end after me. I want to just plus one what Edith said, but more than an AI, I think folks for a while now have been asking me like, oh, what is the next sexy thing in technology and in politics, whatever. And the biggest thing I've been telling people is like integration, like, right. And it goes back to the data flow bullet that I mentioned earlier. Integration. I think a lot of the problem with the tools in the marketplace is that they're closed, like, right. So if I have a data set somewhere else, or if I need an action to be taken from something else, it really gets hard to integrate those things into one flow, right? And so for me, I think the more you can open up your tool set to API, because to Danielle points, there's like multiple cases of everything, right? And that cannot be built by every single tool. So I think the more you can open up your tool, allow us to kind of tinker around the edges or bring in other tools or bring in data from other places, the more it is, you know, the more we can take advantage of it the way we see fit in that particular campaign, in that particular culture, in that particular, you know, district, right? And so to me, the name of the game is integration. Dave?
That's a great point, Henry, and dovetails nicely into the point I was going to make on in campaigns, generally speaking, time is our biggest enemy in campaigns. It's the one resource where everyone has equal amounts of it, and it's always slipping away from us. It's one thing we can't get back. And that is no truer than when it comes to once early and absentee vote starts and ballots are going out, the time it takes and the amount of just chaos that starts going into the system overall, and lists are getting exchanged and mail is going out the door and texts are going and people are returning ballots and people are going, like, it is so much chaos in there. I think one of the biggest things that the overall industry in elections, generally speaking, the better we can get at being able to fast, quickly, and accurately get information in the door of who has voted, how they voted, and get those removed, get those updated to lists and everything else. It saves time. It saves precious resources going into that final stretch. There's nothing more frustrating, I think, on campaigns than going and knocking or going and delivering a piece of mail or a text and someone's already voted. Like, there is absolutely no point in doing that at that point anymore. And so being able to have that accurate, quick, updated, easy information flow, to Henry's point, that is integrated with everything is critical.
So we are, I believe, running up against our time limit. So unless there are further questions, or further comments, I'd like to thank our panelists for an extraordinary hour of information on the early vote strategies, and be certain if you have questions to direct them to our panel, and you can get their contact information through the AAPC website.
Yes, thank you.
Anything?
Thank you, Rick. Yes, thank you all for joining us, and a special thank you to all of our presenters for your contributions today. Today's program will be available for playback in the AAPC webinar archive, so keep an eye on your inbox for an email with a recording link. And before you go, a quick survey will pop up on your screen at the close of the webinar, so we'd appreciate it if you could take a moment to share your feedback on today's program. Also, don't miss our upcoming events, including the 2024 California Regional Conference on June 24th and 25th in San Jose, California. For more details and registration, visit our website or email us at info@theaapc.org. Thank you once again to our presenters and attendees. This program is copyright 2024 by the American Association of Political Consultants, all rights reserved. This concludes today's webinar. You may now disconnect. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you, folks.